on, but it didn't work.
That's okay, just yell.
Yeah, yeah, now it works. I'm amazed, as Erika said, there were so many fascinating aspects in this paper, especially how women can operate as humanitarian agents and can fly under the radar because they're deemed unpolitical or less political than men, and then the men take over. In my research with American groups, ACLU, this is always the same pattern. I would be interested whether you could find any data or material or sources on how these highly educated and underpaid women were received in the villages. I mean, you mentioned that the parents were grateful, of course, and but I'd imagine with mayors there and with male authority figures that these women might have had a problem, even though they brought some sort of upward social mobility or civilization. How were they? Is there any data on that? How they could operate in daily life, in everyday life there?
It's a very good question. The data that I have is episodic and qualitative rather than quantitative. But what I can say is that, let me talk a little bit about the Lega Nazionale. From 1890 until the end of the 20s, the young women who operated the Lega Nazionale often came from the villages or nearby countryside where they ended up teaching. From 1890 until 1918, these women were working primarily in Italian-dominated towns. And it was only after the First World War that George Pitacco, the head of the Lega Nazionale, decided that it was time for the Lega Nazionale to go into Istria and Dalmatia and start more aggressively penetrating the Slavophone regions. And here, I think the Lega Nazionale teachers ran into more difficulty, but they also describe in their annual reports, for example, good relations with the parents, sometimes tense relations, especially with the fascist mayors, who are not always that fun to work with. When the Italia Redenta comes in, one of the things that's very striking is that compared to the Lega Nazionale, the teachers that work for the Italia Redenta, there's a much higher turnover. They basically move from town to town year after year. And there's some evidence that they ruffle the feathers of the different local fascist authorities.
I also thank you for this very, can you hear me? Yeah. Very interesting lecture. My question would be regarding, you talked at the beginning about how the Italian state supported, and what a big effort was by the Italian state to support these associations and so on. My question would be, can we compare this situation with the situation after World War II? Or is there any possibility to compare how much, or it was the effort bigger after World War I, because they have to prove these provinces were Italian, and after World War II, the same, but they lost most of those provinces, but Trieste region and Venezia Giulia and so on. So can it be comparable in any way? Thank you.
I think it's an excellent question. I think it's definitely worth comparing them, but what I'm struck by are the differences. But there are undoubtedly some continuities as well, particularly in the Friuli region. One thing that I think would be interesting to do in the post-World War II era, and that I intend to do, one thing would be to look and see what happens to the teachers and the school buildings and the equipment in the Slovenian and Croatian areas, Dalmatia and Istria, once they've gone back to Yugoslavia. And there's some evidence in the archives of the ONER that they believed that some of the teachers had been murdered. Sometimes you'll see names, a list of names, and it will say so-and-so, and then they'll say, this person has gone here, has gone home, and sometimes they'll write Freude next to a name, but with a question mark. But I suspect it's very variable on the ground, and I just won't know until I get into those archives. But it would also be interesting to compare Trieste with Udine, the Friuli and the Trieste area. And the reason that would be interesting is that Trieste was under the Allied military government for almost 10 years, whereas Friuli was part of Italy. And what that meant was that passage across the borders between Trieste and Istria was strictly controlled. But passage across the borders from Friuli into Slovenia were not controlled. And there was a big tradition of people moving across, artisans moving across that border for work and a lot of sort of itinerant peddlers and workers. And those exchanges continued. So it creates two very different Italian settings for the schools to continue. And there's much that I don't know about it, but I think that's what's interesting is the way that national political and geopolitical circumstances shift after the Second World War. It's very complicated, and I haven't done the research yet.
Okay. Thank you for this amazing presentation. My questions are somehow connected to Dagmar's one. And I wanted to ask you what was, according to the sources, to the available sources, what was the level of politicization of these teachers and other employees of these irredentist associations? And was there within this association any commission or body in charge of inquiring into the political background, political loyalty, or morality of these teachers?
It's an excellent question, very interesting. And to take the second question first, there was no body, no official body that sought to look into their background. They basically used local connections and people who they knew in order to recruit the young women. And as far as the political orientation of the teachers, there's not really very much evidence. I mean, they're there and they're working for these, for this organization, so that gives an idea that they're probably not socialists, they're probably not Slovenian activists, but really what they are, as far as I can tell, are young women from quite poor families who need a job. And I do have one interesting piece of evidence from the mid-20s where one of these teachers was moved from one town to another because she failed at the impossible mission of both being a propagandist and not stirring up the local population. She stirred up the local population, and they basically had to fish her out and transfer her to another town. But that's just one isolated example. I think the high turnover is for a lot of reasons. Sometimes because the teachers get sick and can't deal with the climate in one area, and so they have to be moved to a less harsh climate. That's really all I know.
Molly, you have the privilege to address the very last question of this question time.
Oh dear, I'm sure it won't be good. I'm wondering if it's a connected question in some ways, actually, to Francesca's. Again, about sort of ideology. But I'm wondering if you're familiar with Eden Knudson's work. She wrote this book called Mussolini's Children. And I think now she's working in Südtirol on some kinds of similar questions. Anyway, she makes the argument that it became more or less explicitly taught, racial ideology became more or less explicitly taught in like this sort of early childhood, the schooling. And I'm wondering if you see any evidence of that, or if you think that's not an appropriate argument for the schools that you're looking at.
Can you give me the name of the author again?
Her name is Eden Knudsen.
Eden, like E-D-E-N?
E-D-E-N, and her last name is Knudsen, K-N-U-D-S-E-N.
I'm sorry, could you spell the last name again?
I think it's K-N-U-D-S-E-N.
Knudsen, I
And the
see.
book is called Mussolini's
Yeah.
Children, yeah.
Okay. That's a very interesting argument. One thing that you get from comparing the archives of the Lega Nazionale with those of the ONER is related to this picture, actually, which is that what you see when the school inspectors go around the Lega Nazionale schools from the very beginning until the very end of the Lega's existence, the kids aren't clean. And there's a lot of somewhat sympathetic discussion of the fact that many of the children they've not been washed, their fingernails haven't been cut, they wipe their noses on their sleeves because they don't have handkerchiefs. And the school inspectors are particularly attentive to the fact that some of these children don't have mothers. And so nobody's really giving them the kind of maternal care that they need. At the same time, they're concerned about the lack of hygiene. They want the school teachers to wash the unwashed in front of the other kids in order to teach everyone a lesson about hygiene, which of course I'm sure would be the end of that child ever going back to that school again. And you don't see this kind of thing in the ONER schools because the ONER schools are run by a combination of teachers and nurses. So they've got a different kind of oversight, which puts the socio-hygienic and educational, linguistic, etc., moral education stuff together much more tightly. They're woven together much more tightly. That's why I refer to it as polyvalent socio-educative service. And that hygiene is absolutely at the center of these activities. And I'm just going to use your question as an occasion to run through a few of these pictures. These are all from these Italia Rivento schools. This is 1930. I'll get to these pictures later. They're very interesting, but every time you look at these pictures, the kids are washing. They're washing outdoors. They're washing in well-lit places. So there's all this stuff about the hygiene and the health of the children. And that is, of course, very connected with the battle for births. It's very connected with
So if not racist, then maybe eugenicist.
It's eugenicist,
Okay.
exactly. It is eugenicist, and in the sense also that you can transform these children physically because you've got them young. So you can feed them, you can give them cod liver oil, it's what people call soft eugenics. I really hate that expression. Because eugenics was medical practice, right? All doctors and social workers across Europe and America in the interwar years were eugenicists. It was at the center of social medicine. So there they are. Okay, I should stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Laura Lidons for her amazing lecture and for those who animated the discussion. Let's have 5 minutes of break now.